Hi, well, praise the Lord Jesus. I'm Dr. Courtney, and in this episode of Debunking 101, we're discussing the epistemological distinctions between science and history. Science was born from man's desire to acquire knowledge with greater certainty and objectivity than is available from authoritative sources and expert opinions. Since human opinion is fallible, a method was invented to provide greater objectivity through the testability of ideas. Science is the area of natural philosophy that seeks to describe natural laws and processes by demanding that hypothetical laws and descriptions of natural processes are consistent with repeatable or reproducible experiments. Experimental repeatability allows scientific assertions to be tested with a level of objectivity and certainty that is unavailable in other areas of empirical knowledge. The two key components of this definition of science are the subject addressed, which is natural law, and the method of testing hypotheses, which is repeatable experiment. Addressing different subjects or employing different methods may be valid and interesting intellectual endeavors, but they fall outside of the scope of science if we use this definition. The underlying idea behind science is that all physical processes are governed by a set of rules. Discovering these rules, or at least close approximations for certain circumstances, is the goal of scientific inquiry. Thus, the questions science addresses are: what physical processes are allowed to happen, under what circumstances does each process occur, and how can predictions be made regarding what will happen given sufficient information about the initial conditions. The epistemological arbiter for scientific investigation into physical laws is repeatable experiment. The arbiter of truth in science is repeatable experiment. Science demands that experiments that test, that support or refute hypothetical models must be able to be reproduced a large number of times. If the initial conditions are sufficiently well controlled, the outcome of an experiment should be the same. Now, quantum mechanics and stochastic processes introduce a probabilistic aspect to this, allowing for different possible outcomes, but each has a well-defined probability of occurring in a large number of experimental trials. This demand for reproducible experiments gives science its objectivity. Since any research group should be able to witness an experimental result if they take sufficient care to conduct their experiment under the same conditions as those who reported the earlier results. This alone gives science a level of objectivity and certainty that is unavailable in other areas of empirical knowledge. Other definitions of science are possible, but they are less specific. Some might define science as what scientists do. This definition is problematic because it has ambiguous boundaries, is considerably less objective. This definition is circular, and this definition is subject to changing over time. Another broad definition of science is models supported by observation. This definition removes the requirement of repeatable experiment and broadens the realm of applicability from questions of natural law to questions of history and nearly every other question that the human mind can devise. More importantly, this overly broad definition of science contains the implicit presupposition that observations that are limited in scope, audience, and duration are as equally reliable as experimental observations that are repeatable a large number of times by any audience that bothers to exercise sufficient experimental care. One wonders to what degree documented observations of other parties are admissible. Should less reliable observations that aren't repeatable but that are documented by others have the same status as repeatable experiments? Forensic science is an example that falls under the overly broad definition of models supported by observation. Forensic science is the application of science to analyze physical evidence to determine facts in matters of legal significance. The legal system recognizes that the availability and quality of evidence degrades with time. Increasing entropy guarantees that historical questions cannot be repeatedly tested as many times and by as many independent parties as questions of natural law. Most often in forensic science, the facts in question are matters of what happened, rather than what can happen and how. As such, forensic science is more concerned with questions of history rather than questions of natural law, because it uses well-established results of science, the physical laws, to address the question of what happened in a specific case. The distinction between forensic science and history is not fundamental, but it only depends on potential legal application. From an epistemological viewpoint, history is distinct from science both because it addresses different fundamental questions and because it uses different methods. Historical models are not testable by reproducible experiments beyond determining whether or not they are consistent with natural law. It is simply not possible to reproduce all the conditions with sufficient specificity without a priori knowledge of what happened. Historical hypotheses are commonly tested by considering three broad classes of evidence: eyewitness testimony, documentary evidence, and physical evidence. Thus, forensic science is really a historical discipline that focuses on the analysis of the physical evidence to determine what happened as relevant to a legal proceeding. In the absence of corroborating documentary and eyewitness evidence, the results of forensic science are not compelling in court. For example, the person collecting the evidence must testify to its source and establish its relevance, and also establish the chain of custody. It needs to be documented throughout the process. Results of historical analysis of physical evidence can be supported by corroborating documentary and eyewitness evidence, and also called into question by conflicting documentary or eyewitness evidence. In contrast, corroborating documentary and eyewitness evidence is superfluous. It's unnecessary in questions of natural law that can be repeated, that can be tested by repeatable experiment by any audience that exercises sufficient experimental care. If a crime scene analyst testifies that the evidence was not collected as claimed by the prosecution, facts in that case may never be established with certainty. In contrast, if a scientist claims that experimental data was falsified, relevant models of natural law can be thoroughly investigated by independent experiments, regardless of past falsification of data. Thus, forensic science is something of a misnomer to the discipline that applies science to determine facts of legal significance, because forensic science answers questions of what happened, historical questions, using well-established physical laws rather than investigating hypothetical natural laws by means of repeatable experiments. Why is it important to make these distinctions between science and history? Certainly those applying science to historical questions should be trained in science if their analysis is to be considered trustworthy. Distinctions are important in potential falsifiability and in understanding the relative levels of certainty with which scientific and historical theories can be objectively supported. Since questions of natural law are testable with a large number of reproducible experiments, they are subject to the potential of future falsifiability in ways that many historical theories are not. If the presuppositions that went into an experimental design or interpretations are found to be flawed long after the initial result, theories of natural law can be repeatedly tested with revised presuppositions. In contrast, the death of eyewitnesses, the destruction of documents, and the degradation of physical evidence over time tends to slowly erode our ability to test historical hypotheses. For example, the discovery of arsenic in Napoleon's hair hints at foul play, but we are less certain of the source of this hair sample than would be needed to gain a criminal conviction in court. Likewise, DNA testing might suggest a likelihood that Thomas Jefferson fathered children by his slave, but one would be hard-pressed to win a paternity suit on the weight of the evidence available in that specific case. The ability to interpret historical evidence sometimes improves with technological advances, but the available evidence itself for testing historical theories only grows dimmer with time. In contrast, the ability to test natural laws grows steadily along with the scientific knowledge base and technological advances that can be leveraged for greater observational and interpretational ability. The standard of testability for models of natural law is firm and immovable, repeatable experiment. In contrast, the standard of support for historical theories is much more flexible, depending on the amount of evidence that can be reasonably expected, rather than a firm and rigid evidentiary standard universally applied to all questions. The evidentiary standard for publishing an undisputed assertion in a history book about something that happened over 1,000 years ago is often a brief mention in a document that's more contemporary to the original event. The standard for historical events several hundred years ago is usually a preponderance of documentary support. The standard for publishing news in a modern newspaper is usually confirmation by multiple sources. The standard for a criminal conviction is usually sufficiently compelling evidence to put the matter beyond a reasonable doubt in the jury's mind. Some subjects in cosmology provide additional examples. I took a graduate course at MIT from Alan Guth, who made important advances by adding the inflation model to the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory, including the inflation model, is an example where cosmology is focused on past events and more accurately classified as history rather than science. However, cosmology also tries to make testable predictions of future events. For example, whether or not the universe is open, will keep expanding indefinitely, or closed, meaning it will eventually contract under gravitation. In conclusion, questions of natural law can be answered more objectively than questions of history, because the results must make testable predictions about future events, and they must be reproducible by independent parties. Scientific theories can be revisited an indefinite number of times in the future as advances in scientific knowledge base and the available technology improve our observational abilities.
If you see what I see, that the grave is empty, then you know what I know. Anything is possible. If you see what I see, that the grave is empty, then you know